Hi, I'm Aga Bajer.
Hi, I'm Shani Person.
Welcome to The Deep Dive, a monthly Culture Lab podcast where we dive headfirst into a topic that is crucial for building thriving cultures at scale. Join us as we geek out and explore the intricacies of culture, discussing everything from the latest trends to timeless philosophies.
With each episode, we take a deep dive into a specific area, offering unique perspectives and insights on how to create and sustain a culture that fosters growth, innovation, and success.
Whether you are a business leader, HR professional, or just someone interested in understanding how cultures work, the Culture Lab's Deep Dive is the show for you.
So sit back, relax, and get ready to take the plunge into the fascinating world of culture with us.
And today we are going to talk about
company values.
This episode is brought to you by CultureBrained, a one-of-a-kind accelerator program where culture leaders get hands-on support and guidance on how to reach their goals faster, especially now in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. CultureBrained connects you with outstanding peers on the same journey, but also with world-class experts, including people you know from the show. And they all help you identify and implement new, better ways of creating a culture where people do their best work. Check it out at tinyurl.com/culturebrained. And no need to write it down. There's a link in the show notes. I've been inspired by Aaron Dignan's and Rodney Evans' show. I don't know if you know it. It's called Brave New Work. They were both guests on the Culture Lab show. And I started using check-ins at the start of some meetings the idea is basically to give everyone time to settle into the meeting and get ready to engage. So let's do a check-in question, shall we?
Yeah, that sounds great.
So the question for today is, what are your core values and how do you use them?
Big question. The first thing that comes up for me is I actually think they change a little sometimes. There are a lot of things at the core, but what kind of is top of the list is a dynamic thing throughout life, depending on your context and what you need. And I'm not saying this to avoid the question. When it comes to my core values, I would say generosity is one. It comes into play for me in a lot of different ways. And I think the best anecdote for me to describe why it's important is when I was in high school and university, I used to take meticulous notes, a lot of them. People would always ask me if they could have my notes. And I would always say, yes, go ahead, go copy them, do whatever you want with them. And I would always get people asking me, how are you giving them notes? They're going to go and do really well. And I would say, I really hope so. They won't do what I will do with them, but they will do something else. And that's great. It's just this very, very core to me in big and small, not being stingy about who you are or what you know. Yeah, it's not a competition. It's very much what we can create together. So I think generosity for me sits very much at the core of that. And to tie to those, I have curiosity and growth right now that are standing out. And I think they play out very much in the sense that I'm always asking questions, a lot of them. And
you are.
I try to, I am,
Yeah.
you would know. I try to do that with humility in different contexts, be it in my close relationships with my own children, in my profession, to depart from the place of the fact that I don't have the answers, or definitely not all of them. And growth being very, very central and has been for a lot of years for me in terms of, I think, and a question is part of that. I use the questions to understand how I can become better, a better person, better partner, colleague, mother. And that's not to say I beat down on myself. I think all of these kind of mesh together and they're very much essential to my being in any context of my life.
Yeah, that's so connected. And by the way, we have one in common for sure, because one of mine is be curious, but you also talk about generosity. One of mine is be kind, and it's close. So for me, kindness is about being generous, but also it's really about, doing the thing that is the right thing for the other person. And sometimes it's maybe not necessarily being nice, but being honest, for example. So, and definitely being generous. Yeah, it's part of that. So we have like these two in common for sure. And growth is super important for me as well. But I think I express it slightly differently. So first I had these first three. I really articulated them a long time ago. And I had these three: be bold, be kind, and be curious. And then I added two more recently, like really recently. And I'm going against my own advice, by the way, because when we talk with clients, companies, I say, don't go above 4 because 4 is already a lot. Like 5 is really way too much. But the ultimate test, I don't know what you think of this, is can you remember them? If you can remember them, then it's okay, I think, to have 5. But if it's hard to remember them, it's definitely a no-go. Like, don't have 5 if it's hard for you to list them. But I do remember mine. One of my 2 new values, my value number 4, is be wise. And being wise, predominantly what it means to me is being able to differentiate between what is within my circle of control and what is not. So that was number 4. So the 5th one of the 2 new ones, is be free. That's not so much like not being shackled by external constraints as much it is for me about being free from my own hang-ups or desires or whatever, and just being driven by things that are not entirely conscious, I guess. And that goes back to this whole concept of being mindful and present in the moment as well. Like when I think of mine, I also feel like they're very interconnected. Like one doesn't make sense without the other. Do you think that it's an important thing for company values as well, that they are interconnected and that one cannot exist without the other?
I love that question. I think so. I think they have to kind of make sense. There has to be some red thread. And sometimes I think values can contradict each other too, right? They're not necessarily always coherent in the positive way. Sometimes they pull in different directions. I think so. It's a little bit of a story we tell, right, around our values. And it's the same in companies, I feel. It has to sink into the context. It has to be able to become concrete for people.
Yeah. And, speaking of becoming concrete and kind of actionable, I think this would be my follow-up question to you. Thinking of your values of generosity, curiosity, and growth, how do you use them in your daily life? Like, how do they, do you integrate them somehow in your daily life consciously, or do they sit somewhere at the back of your mind? How do you work with them?
Just listening to you, I would add a 4th one to myself as well, which is courage. Because I never want to choose things from fear.
Same here. That's why I have be bold.
Yeah. It kind of answers your question on practicing. I mean, if we look at personal development and on that side, there's this whole terminology of embodiment. And I always like to find parallels in other places and things that are comprehensible to us because it can feel so fluffy to people. That's a word that many like to use for this. Yeah, it's not that I walk around with the words in my head. I think based on them, they become like a set of principles. If courage is one, then that impacts how I might make decisions. If generosity is one, that impacts how I deal with different interactions with people and how much I share in those. And I think it impacts my choices a lot. Growth, for example, drives me to go towards friction and discomfort rather than avoid it. It invites me to go, hey, there's an opportunity here. you're welcome to dive in and explore how this might contribute to your growth. So it's a pretty philosophical question on that level, but I try to think about those things that are important to me. I try to understand what I need to be able to act them out. I know I listened to, I think it was Africa Brooke. She's a contemporary thinker that I really, really appreciate. She talks about the be, do, have model, and it kind of inverts the thinking on values, for example. So if I want to embody this value, or if I want to be a certain thing, I want to be an author, or I want to be something else, or I want to be kind, who do I get to be? What does that person look like? What are the actions that this person takes? And then what do I have as a result? And sometimes just kind of working it backwards, because I do believe in supporting yourself in a practical way also to act it out. It's hard if you don't think it through a little. So it's a mix, I think. Yeah, I carry it with me as questions a lot that I try to like bring up. What about you? What does that look like for you? I'm really curious.
People are not going to see that because we only do audio, but that's my journal. And recently I also used this book, which is called, I think, The 5 book. And it's basically like planning for your next 5 years. Who are you going to be and where are you going to be in 5 years from now? But in my journal, there is a section where I have a page dedicated to each of these values. And I journal every morning in my journal. And so I'll flip back and I'll also add some behaviors or ways of bringing it to life that come up for me in the moment as I'm reflecting on how I want to go about my day and so on and so forth. And what I do, it's this practice that is quite an ancient practice, I guess. It's called premeditatorio malorum, which is basically premeditating what can go wrong in your day. It's a practice from the Stoic philosophy. Definitely not for people who are all about, envision success and how amazing your day is going to be. But this is the totally opposite. So you are basically sort of rehearsing your day and thinking of what can go wrong. Like, for example, I look at my calendar and I see back-to-back meetings. I'm thinking, okay, what if one of the meetings overruns and I get something overlapping with something else? I'm late, I'm stressed and nervous, etc., etc. What's going to happen then? And that is an opportunity for me to think, like, how do I want to show up with my values during the day? So I think it's one of the things that is part of my daily practice. So reflection, I guess, is a big part of that for me. And it's kind of really an ongoing process of defining what it looks like for me in daily life. So that kind of helps. But, it's interesting also what you've mentioned about thinking, who do I want to become? So that piece around being. One thing that comes up for me is this Greek word, eudaimonia, I think it's being pronounced in English. And what it means in ancient Greek is basically living in harmony with your demon, which is your inner highest self, which is exactly, I think, what you were talking about. Like, who do you want to become? And then holding yourself to that standard of the person that you are not yet, but you aspire to be. I find this to be super powerful as well. Like, how can I live my day to day in a way that there's this mythical creature that I will never become, but the direction in which I want to go feels a little bit closer, like this ideal feels a little bit closer. And this is, by the way, how I think about cultivating a great company culture as well, that it's this ongoing process of steering towards a certain ideal and being realistic about the fact that you'll probably never get there, right? Because there is no there. But it's about this journey and getting better every single day and kind of also taking personal responsibility for, if we want to be a company whose value is, being innovative, then what is my contribution to that? And what are the behaviors that I can display in my daily interactions with my colleagues to contribute to, bringing this higher being to life.
I love the way you pinpointed that. And it also, because it encompasses how I approach this also from a company perspective, I think. I talk a lot about falling in love with the impact. And for me, that kind of means kind of holding the vision in your heart or holding the vision in front of you, but being where you are. Doesn't necessarily mean, as you're saying, you're going to get there. It is about in every opportunity you have, or in every type of interface, or in every type of solution, asking yourself, how is this meeting the vision that we have or the impact that we want to create? And it can come down to really practical things. So I think from a corporate perspective, then what I've seen a bit with research is it's very easy to create dissonance between, the values that you write and the stories that you tell, and then the reality that you stage for people.
Right.
So I think for me, that work is also about that. Of course, you holding your vision, and that's the story that you tell, but you also have to ask yourself that as you're creating a setting. So in what goals are you putting in place for people? What processes are there? What systems are they using? Are they living up to that standard? Are they helping us behave and go towards that direction now? Not in 10 years or wherever you're thinking you're going to arrive there. Now, in this moment. And I think we often miss it. I'm a little bit allergic to the models that put culture as a separate aspect to everything.
Mm-hmm.
I always like to relate to it as an outcome, not as an animal in its own right, because then it just becomes about this messaging. When actually culture can, if you look at it from the practical way of like your culture or your values, in the end, the lived culture is just the total result of all the things that you do and all the settings that you create and everything and how it comes out in the end. So how you're experiencing it, if you're experiencing my generosity, it's not because I tell you that's my value. It's because I act that value in the way that we relate to each other. And I think that also goes in a macro scale. If you're saying customer focus is a core value of yours, you need to think about how only having sales goals is going to impact their ability to actually act that value out, for example.
I really resonate with that idea of making sure that we need to address what's happening in the moment and enabling these behaviors that we want to see more of. I'm also curious about what you've said around, we shouldn't address culture as this separate thing, because I think I have a slightly different take on that, and I'm curious what you think about it. So one thing that I've noticed, obviously, I think it's truism about culture, is that often it is invisible in plain sight. It's so ubiquitous, right? And we really don't often see it, think about it, but of course it drives everything that we do at work. And the way I think about this is, if you want to cultivate culture intentionally, you really have to make the invisible visible, because otherwise it's going to be really, really difficult to do something about it. And in order to make the invisible visible, which I totally appreciate your point about how interconnected it is with everything, but it seems to me that sometimes to make the invisible visible, you need to create an environment where you almost separate it from the rest and look at it not as a separate entity, but as something that you pay attention to. And one of the things that I say is that Peter Drucker, said culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I like saying yes, but only when it craves attention. And so when it's hungry for attention, it's going to eat your strategy for breakfast. But if you give it attention, then it should be all right. And so for me, in order to give your culture the attention it deserves, you put the spotlight on it somehow. And so in a way, you could say that you focusing on it as a separate thing. So I don't know what your thoughts on this are.
Yeah, I like what you're saying. I don't think that our thinking, it's not mutually exclusive. I agree with you. you also have to be clear on what your aim is for your culture if you want to intentionally create it. You have to have a dialogue around it. You have to figure out how it grounds into your strategy and how it contributes towards it, how you want to communicate it, and then how you act it out through all the practical tools. So in my head, listening to it, I'm like, yeah, these are like complementary ideas. Of course, it needs to be able to take up space. I think that's not necessarily how I see it. When I talk about how it sits in a model, I think that sometimes when it sits in these blocked models of culture goes here, this goes here, then culture in a lot of those contexts ends up being solely about communication and leadership and doesn't tie into the practical reality of how it actually manifests. Because you can see signs of a culture in many ways. Like, I think a great example is I've lived in several countries in Europe and I now live in Sweden. And you can tell that Swedes like to be able to walk because our sidewalks are very wide. There's plenty of space to walk on sidewalks. Whereas in other countries in the South, it's not built for like people going on long walks and lots of people going on walks. The sidewalks are tiny. You can hardly fit there with a pram with your child.
Athens, where I live, yeah, it's impossible to walk.
So I think it's also just understanding these are kind of the buttons you can twist to make your culture come alive. And it can be really practical things. And yeah, of course, I think, both the story and the space taking and it being an intentional thing that we do, same as your practice in the morning. You think about it. You reflect on how it can come into play, how you want to be able to show up with those values. And I think it's the same is, of course, we need to have that reflection and then we need to translate it into action. And that's why I think I sometimes object it sitting as a thing, because then it becomes just this story and it doesn't translate into the action. That's usually what I'm after when I talk about that is how do you take the story and the space and make it come alive in a way that makes people feel like there's follow through. It's not just empty stories and words.
Yeah, exactly. Which is exactly what I wanted us to dive in today, because we have this theme of the month in the CultureBrained community every month. And one of the topics that comes up again and again and again is exactly what you have mentioned, which is how do we activate and embed our corporate values into everything that we do? And of course, it's a huge conversation. There are so many different aspects of activating values and embedding values. But I'm curious, when you even, start thinking about this topic, how do we bring those things to life? What pops into your mind first? Especially in the corporate environment, again, right? Where usually, we're really good at articulating what it is that we stand for and not so great in putting it into practice.
First thing that comes to mind is that there is no one answer here. My first question looking at this is usually, how do we come to understand what are the practical things that have the most impact on people's behavior? And those can be different things because behaviors and actions shape how we experience or whether or not we experience a certain culture. In my world, it comes down to behaviors. And that's a really good place to start, because then when you talk to people, and you should talk to people, you can actually ask them, what stops you or helps you being this? Whatever it is, the cultural attribute or value or however you spell it out. So one thing I think is that actually daring to go where the behaviors are, because that's the level where it plays out. And then the answers might be different. What I've seen in the project I've done, the research I've done, is we underestimate how much just a simple tool, system, a single goal can actually really change the face of how you experience a certain value. And I know, for example, I had a few years back, I did some work on customer focus. And I had this group of people working in customer service, and we were just reflecting together on what stops you. And this guy said, and it was a little bit heartbreaking, he goes, I love our customers. I love them. I love this value. I would love to spend all my time making our customers smile. I spend 20 to 30 hours per week in system administration in this 17-year-old system. There was no way for him to act in any different way than administering that system, which that was like the essential actually thing that stopped him from acting that value out to the fullest. So yeah, I often work it backwards. What are the things that are pushing the buttons in the right or wrong direction in relation to this story and this vision that we hold for ourselves? And how can we make the difference as small as possible?
Yeah, I agree, because I think that vision of what we're trying to create as an organization is incredibly important in this whole conversation, right? We do something similar. So we ask typically the companies we work with to really clarify what their vision is for the next 3 years. And then we ask people, okay, so what are the things that you will need to stop doing because they stand in the way of your ability to bring this vision to life? And when we talk about things that you need to stop doing, it's not just about behaviors. It's also mindsets, beliefs, assumptions that we tend to embrace, and behaviors as well. Like, what are the things that needs to stop happening? Because otherwise we will not get there. And then we also ask, what do you need to keep doing? And this is the good stuff that is already happening, and you need to maintain it. You need to make sure that you really nurture that because it's already at the core of your culture. You're doing it well, and it's helping you to get to where you want to get. And obviously, there are going to be things that you need to start doing. So you're not doing it yet. You don't have that mindset, but it's going to be necessary to develop in order to be successful. And I think that that piece around what do you need to stop doing that you've mentioned is so super important, because it really gives you a lot of insight into what is even worth, putting your energy into. Because if that's an obstacle, I'll go back to Stoicism for a moment and make another reference. There's a saying, the obstacle is the way. In Stoicism, is this whole idea, that you make plans, and then, of course, there is something that stands in your way. And for a lot of us, it's like, damn, why is this happening to me? And how can we overcome this? But what Stoicism says is, no, actually, it's all about asking yourself, right, so how do we work with that so that it becomes the path? And I find this in the culture work very interesting, because, for example, if you find that obstacle of I don't have the right modern system to deal with the administrative part of customer service, then that becomes the path to a better customer service. You buy a new system, you modernize your system, you train people on that, and this is how you enable customer-centric culture. So I love it. And I didn't even know that we were so aligned around this, but I would really encourage our listeners to embrace all the obstacles that you notice in your way to the culture that you want to cultivate, because this is exactly the way to get there. Would you agree with that, Shani?
Definitely. It made me think of this Swedish poet. He has this song, and he sings that a wall is just a bridge standing up. It's just which is the obstacle is the path. Yeah, I agree. And to add to that, I also do think that it is important to, as you're saying, start, stop, continue. There are many things to continue as well, and to figure out where are the things that actually boost where it's actually happening. And I like that principle from positive psychology, was it's asking this inverted question of what we're really used to doing is, where is the problem? How do we fix it? Is saying, where is it working? How do we expand that? How do we scale it up? So I actually like both those contrasting ideas a lot. I think usually there's a little bit more urgency in the things that don't work. because they create a lot of friction and frustration. And those are things you might want to eliminate to build more goodwill. So it might just be a strategic thing. And I think when I say behaviors, it also means for me actually getting down to understanding the practical things that impact it.
Like systems, practices, rituals, all that
Yeah.
stuff, right? Yeah.
Processes, decision structures, a lot of things. And these are different in different parts of organizations, for different professions. So it's also important to have a representative average of people that you're talking to. But I would say, yeah, both play a role there.
Both play a role there. And we are both, I think, big fans of paradoxical thinking. And for our listeners who are not familiar with that school of thought, I'd really encourage you to listen to a couple of interviews that I've already done with Wendy Smith, Professor Wendy Smith, who recently published this beautiful book, Both and Thinking. And so I totally resonate with what you have just said. It's definitely not just focusing on the obstacles. It's not just focusing on what works well. Ideally, you would like to do both. And an interesting thing in this, what is working already, is that some things are working already in one part of your organization, but not in the other part of the organization. And so you have these bright spots. And I think it's so incredibly interesting to learn from what the people in the bright spots are doing, what tools they're using, what processes they're using, and figuring out ways to scale it throughout your organization. And that is very often one of the challenges when it comes to activating and embedding values in an organization. That, yes, you do have those bright spots. You do have those individuals, the culture carriers or the values carriers or cultivators, whatever you want to call them, or stewards. But how do you enable others to embrace that? What are your thoughts on that? Have you seen anything interesting in companies when it comes to learning from what's already working?
The first sentence that came to my head as you were asking the question was, it's not just a communications effort. Actually, when I was doing some research a few years back, I was looking at Disney. They work it from the customer experience angle. You might translate it equally into the employee experience or culture angle if you like. But they are extremely specific and intentional to the level of a key thing they want to be able to provide their customers is a clean park. And so they stood outside of their different establishments, food, other merchandise, whatever it is they're selling. And they measured how far a person goes before they drop litter on the ground. And that's how often they have a bin.
Yeah.
And I think for me, that's a very representative example of embodying something that you want to create. And I know I would be fooled if I remembered the actual hotel chain, but it might be Ritz-Carlton, and I might be wrong because it was a few years ago that I was looking at this. But I know they had a lovely example of, again, they had a value of providing a really high-end experience to their guests. So they gave each employee a budget of, I think, $200.
Yeah, that's Ritz. Yeah.
Per employee to be able to fix an experience that wasn't right. They didn't need to use the whole budget. They could use $50. They could use $10. You could buy some chocolate, a flower, repair something, send their clothes to dry. I don't know, whatever it would be to come up with. Did that to empower people everywhere along the line of service to make those decisions on their own without having to revert back to their manager to get decisions. That's also a fantastic example of if your value is, there might be dual values here. It might be more about their experience, but it might also be about their ambition to have less kind of top-down, more initiative, more creativity, things like that. There are many ways to interpret it, but I think for me, it's a really good example of taking an intention and a value that works both ends, work both for the employee and for the customer, and It's usually a really good balance to try and work out and translate that into something that helps people act in a different way.
Yeah, yeah. It's this whole principle of, I think, behavioral economics, which is, if you want to engage in a behavior, even yourself, sometimes it's even hard to change our own behaviors. The first step is, how can you make it easy, right? How can you make this behavior easy? And there was a series of studies. For example, how can you maximize the chances of someone going to the gym after work? So they've noticed that if people have their gym bag in their car already and they don't need to stop at home to pick up their gym bag and then go to the gym, the chances of them actually getting to the gym are multiplied exponentially. It's something crazy, but it's just, how can you make those things easier for people? It's a little bit like with the sidewalks that you've mentioned earlier. If you want people to walk in your city, build the damn sidewalks, right?
Yeah.
Don't expect them to go through those narrow, broken, tiny sidewalks with the fear that they're going to fall into a pothole. You need to create the conditions that enable people to engage in these behaviors. And I remember one piece of work that we did once with a professional organization, and they were very, very keen on reinventing themselves because the market and the services that they were providing was shrinking. They did have extremely bright people and a lot of expertise that was transferable to other slightly different services, but they needed to reinvent themselves in that moment in time. There was this big conversation about how can we help our people to be more innovative. And so, interestingly, we look at what stands in the way of people being innovative. And one thing that people in consulting will know that everyone hates is timesheets. Basically, timesheets and keeping track of your time is this idea that you have to account for. Every company is different, but when I was working at PwC, it was 6-minute increments of your time. So like you had to say, what were you doing during literally every single almost minute of your day, and the chargeability or utilization rate for most consultants, which means basically the amount of time that you bill to a client project is really, really high. So very often it was like 80% of your time. So what that means is that obviously, and because projects are very often undersold, typically in consulting, what that means is that your average consultant is already working 8 or maybe even 9 hours delivering projects to the clients. And if you want to reinvent yourself and create a new business idea, the first question is when? When are you going to do it, right? You don't have the energy, you don't have the time. And so we had this conversation, what if, and we know that it's a risky idea, but what if you either got rid of timesheets and chargeability rates for a small period of time, and so what happened? Or lowered them. And so they decided to pilot it with one of their business units. And they were very, very sheepish about it. There was a lot of fear and insecurity involved, of course. Oh my God, what's going to happen? We're going to go bankrupt. This is going to be a disaster. And interestingly, of course, otherwise I wouldn't be sharing this story if it was a failure. It was a huge success. So that was the only team in the whole company that has actually managed to turn things around in their business, the business that they were dealing, in a really short period of time, because they just took off that pressure, to keep your nose to the grind and demonstrate to everyone that you are super involved in client projects every single second of your day. So there's something definitely there about how do we enable these behaviors in really practical ways, really pragmatic ways. And it's funny because biggest part of the conversation when it comes to activating values that I hear at conferences and stuff, or when companies get acknowledged for amazing things that they do for the culture, This is stuff like communications, an amazing campaign, and swag. And we have cups with our values and posters. And we had this amazing launch event, etc., etc. But rarely will you hear something that is truly practical, that sort of stuff.
For me, that's the embodiment of it, and activation and embedding is in the practical. It's I love that you brought up the gym example, and I've also read about that, but I also often use this as an example. Like, you don't become fit because you have a gym card. It's a little bit the same thing. Like, your values, however you shape them, that's your gym card. You have it. It's nice. You signed the deal. You're paying for it. You made a decision. You chose your gym. Oh, it's good. Here's your card. It's not going to make you fit. It's not going to make you, it's not going to make you anything unless you act with it. And as you were saying, like, build these conditions around it. Buy the food that will help you. Get up, sign up for the class, go to the classes, be consistent about it. And it's this consistency. And I've also experienced that there's a little bit of underestimating how quick and how visible, like this dissonance between what we say and what we do, how visible that actually is to people.
That's the price, right?
Yeah. They're like, no, but that's not an issue. Yes, it is. I can tell you, when I asked the question, it took 30 seconds and there was the list. So people know.
That's the price that the companies are paying. I just love this analogy with a gym card, that you said you pay for it. So you have it, you pay for it, because I think this is exactly what happens with company values that are not being lived. You have it on the card, right? And you pay for it, because exactly the price of the dissonance is so incredibly high. Like, it immediately leads to cynicism, disengagement. So I think it's better not to have the gym card at all.
Yeah.
Right? Than to have
in that case, yes. If you're not going to use it, because I think that's what happens, right? All of a sudden you have the card, you feel guilty if you're not going to the gym. You're paying the price in a lot of ways. Whereas, if you do the effort, you actually gain the benefits. You become fit, you feel healthy, you feel energized, you feel good. Like, then you're embodying it, then you're embedding it into your life. The whole idea of health, for example. So yeah, I totally agree. It's also that, and it's a risky path. For a while, I used to work with employer branding, and it was when it was still a little bit in its cradle. Now it's evolved a lot, so I won't proclaim myself any expert. But I think my reflection with that was always, with that, you can't fake it till you make it. You can only market the things you can actually live up to. Otherwise, it's a dangerous game, and especially in this type of market that we have, where everything is transparent and visible, and you can easily reach people and ask them, and people will openly tell you. They will share criticism. There are forums and places you can go to get authentic images of what it is. So I think the price is also the risk of losing talent that you have, of not attracting the talent that you want, this consistency. I always try to just think of it of, okay, what if the company was a person? How easy is it for us to sense if it's inauthentic or lived? And most of us will feel this, yeah, that's weird. That person is saying this, but they're acting really differently. I don't believe that. I don't want to spend time with him or her. I always try to see, how can I bring it to that very comprehensible level? If somebody tells you this is who I am and they do completely different, then you get disengaged. You develop distrust. You don't really care to evolve the relationship. And I know I had on LinkedIn a question out a while back, and somebody very openly shared what happens when it was a post on surveys, and how, so I was saying, if you're asking questions, you better be ready to act on them, because it creates expectation. And a person was sharing how she said, well, yeah, that's what happens when I see there's no action. I start only acting for myself.
Mm-hmm.
The things that I choose to do at work become only about how I can take advantage of this for my growth, and less about how am I contributing to this greater good, to this goal, to this innovation, whatever it is. So
yeah,
I think the price is also in that space of actually the risk of this disengagement and not maintaining your attraction. And it's easier than it has ever been to gain access to that image.
Yeah, totally. The first thing that it destroys is trust, right? And you can't really build a healthy culture without trust. And so I see the impact that it has on everything from engagement to the actual performance, turnover, profitability, everything. I mean, everything. It's completely crazy. That's why I don't understand sometimes, why do companies make so much effort into articulating and communicating their values and they stop there. This is really criminal, right? Again, don't buy that gym card. Just, spend your money elsewhere. Just don't create this problem for yourself, because it's so much better not to talk about values at all than to have those values on a poster and not living them. I also want to connect to one point that you've mentioned again about bright spots and the things that are already happening in an organization. There's this whole concept, and we work with this. I'm curious whether you've seen it implemented in companies as well, of informal influencers. And basically, what we do is we identify people who have high social capital and high trust and respect from community members, from their colleagues. So these people are nominated by their colleagues as someone who is really well connected within the organization, but also someone who is trustworthy and who has the capability and expertise at a level that people rely on them, rely on the information that they convey, etc., etc. And we engage these people in disseminating behaviors, but we go to really, really granular level. Like, for example, if you want to cultivate a growth culture, we won't simply have a conversation. Okay, so how can you be, the ambassadors of growth mindset? We identify a few behaviors that would enable that and create that environment for others. So these people become role models and they almost create like a viral change. This is not my idea, by the way. It's Leonardo Herrero, who was a guest on our podcast, who has come up with this idea of viral change approach to shaping culture or to culture transformation. And it was really interesting for me as we were learning this approach to find out that the more granular you can become about these behaviors, the better. So, for example, I will ask the following question: what if this was not an obstacle? What would you do? So I will ask more what if questions. And that's it. So they are very, very conscious about displaying certain behaviors quite frequently that we have all agreed in the process of decoding what those behaviors would be during a certain period of time. So typically you will be working on it for a month or so. And it's incredible how powerful these social networks are in terms of disseminating these behaviors. And I think we know that, of course, the social science that gives a lot of evidence that we become the average of the 5 people we interact most with. And so I think the people who are really well connected in the organization really hold a lot of power when it comes to shaping behaviors of their colleagues. And what I found, Shani, so this is a very long-winded way of trying to arrive at a question to you. What I found is that these informal influencers, they very often do not consider themselves as informal influencers, and they would never volunteer for something like that. And yet they are super powerful when it comes to, influencing others. I wonder what you think about this. Have you seen this viral change happen in an organization or even in a different context? And what potential do you see in using this approach to activate values?
I've seen it work and I've seen it fail. And listening to you, I think the failures I've seen have been based on the fact that it wasn't granular enough. It was more of an event-based VIP track where you try to unify this group and give them inspiration, and it's not entirely clear what they are being inspired to do. And they also don't really get any type of mandate or any support in actually doing it or spreading it or scaling somehow. And of course, viral is more of just being where you are and that having impact. So I think I've seen both, and the success piece being much in that granularity of your words and your actions matching, and people getting that sense very clearly, and that really inspiring. And as you're saying, having this set of approaching things in a different way, inspiring people to do things differently, I think there's a huge amount of potential because at the end of the day, I mean, we also take inspiration from other people much more than I think we take instruction from a book. It is inspiring to see how things work and that they work. And then you want to try and you might want to, okay, so I see this person asking questions like this. Actually, it kind of produces a nice impact. Maybe next time I'll try that too. I'll make a note for myself. So yeah, I love the potential of it being in context, in action, in the flow of what we're doing, not separate to it, not a story, but actually actions. And I think the potential and the key success factor are a little bit the same in my world. That is the granularity, it's the being in the flow of things. Those things are the greatest potential and also a risk if you don't get to that level.
I agree. Clarity is kindness, as we like to say. So the clearer you can be about what it looks like, how it can be manifested, the easier you make it on people. And so I think that the kinder it is as an approach, and also you maximize the success rate with these things. I feel the need to share something also about the power of experiences, especially collective experiences and sharing meaning, because I witnessed something incredibly powerful happening in one of the organizations I was running a workshop in. And the workshop was on how to unleash your creative genius. And one of the things that we were doing was an activity in a circle. So basically I had people sitting at round tables in a large room, and then I instructed them to go to the back of the room as fast as they could and form a perfect circle. And to make it playful, I was like, let's do it as fast as possible. So on the count of 3, 3, 2, 1, go. And so people start running towards the back of the room to form this perfect circle. I go there really fast as well. I get into the center of the circle to facilitate the activity. And then the head of that unit, the GM of that, it was an innovation center of a pharmaceutical company. He says, wait, the circle is not perfect yet. We can't start. And I was like, okay, what's missing? And he's like, there's one person who's not here yet. There was a person, a team member, who had disability. He walked, but he was using a walker. And because as people left the space in a rush, there were a million chairs in the way. And so he just couldn't navigate his way. And obviously he couldn't be as fast as everyone else. And it was such a humbling experience for me, first of all, that I didn't register that there was a person with that kind of constraint. But also it was such a powerful experience, I think, for that group in terms of what inclusivity means and what is the expectation, that I am 100% sure, and actually I am still in touch with some of these people, I heard that from them, that they would never ever make the same mistake again, and they would always scan the room to make sure that everyone can do what we are asking them to do. And I know that sometimes we cannot engineer experiences like this, but I also know that there are a lot of opportunities to create an experience like that if you are intentional. Again, what are your thoughts on that? What's an opportunity there for leaders who are listening to this to be intentional and create a collective experience that will land in a similarly powerful way?
there is some complexity in that experience, actually, even if it sounds straightforward, that might be challenging to engineer if you're not used to thinking of experiences. You can definitely, and I mean, this is what I do every day is really think about engineering experiences and embedding culture. How do you make something come to life? And you can think about it from a learning perspective, which is what you're talking about here, having experience that stays with you, that teaches you something, that enlightens you in some way. Yeah, I think there's opportunity. In one way, it's about just starting very simple, asking the question from a very different perspective. We sometimes focus very narrowly on kind of what we need to do, and we don't really know, how do I explain this? One thing I like to do is invert questions.
Give us an example.
In the employee experience space, it's, you can take any term. I know I got hung up on the quiet quitting. It bugged me to no end last year. It's okay, quiet quitting. That's from the perspective of the employer. How would you ask that question, or how would you state that problem from the perspective of the employee instead? And then it might be understanding their why. What are they trying to balance out in life? Maybe they're just, regulating expectations. I don't know. You can get curious of the inverted perspective. And I think to build experiences, sometimes you need to do that. Ask a lot of questions. I was listening to an IDEO podcast. IDEO are one of the in the forefront of developing design thinking and design thinking tools in many ways. And one of the things that stayed with me was somebody who said, you have to ask the right question. And after that, I really found myself going, is this the right question? Is this the right question? In any meeting I was in when we were getting stuck, I tried to reformulate. Okay, so what if I'm looking from this side or from that side? As leaders, if that's the perspective we're taking, how might you step out of your own perspective and not ask, what am I to benefit? Or what is it that I want to pass along? Or what is it that I want to teach? Is, what would be valuable for them? What is it that they need instead? You can evolve it even further. A core is that. And then for experiences, we like to think a lot in journeys, because sometimes when we fail to create a good experience is when we actually don't understand how far they stretch. I worked with a service designer once, and I will always remember she was walking me through this thinking, and she said, Shani, you never just wake up in the middle of a supermarket with a bag of crisps in your hand. You just don't. Your experience starts way before that moment of being in the supermarket with a thing in your hand. When your need comes up, when you're contemplating, which one do I go to? Do I go to the close supermarket? Do I go to the far one? I'll go to this one because I like the choice that they have. You have a lot of interactions. Then you have things that happen after. So I think opportunities lie also in actually looking at the fuller journey. We worked with somebody who were looking to explore how they can make their meeting culture better. One way to do that is not just focus on the moments of the meeting, is to understand what's the journey of before and after one. How can you play with the different moments? So if we take the experience that you were doing, you had the moment of instruction and what happened then, and you were building up energy and you were building up excitement and you were creating some context for them to come around. And then you kind of pressed go, and that was the moment of action. And then there was a moment of stillness and reflection. What was happening then? Okay, there was a moment for things to sink in. So you get to play with these different moments to engineer. And I think that's why I'm saying it depends on what you're engineering. But if you're doing a simple thing like an event, you can also think in terms of the before, during, and after. What does your invite look like? How are you making people feel included? What type of questions are you asking as you're preparing? How are you including other people in your preparation? What does the day look like? Does that accommodate for, I don't know, whatever it is, people needing to move or just change scenery or check in on their work because they have a lot on their agendas? What does the after look like? How do you catch up on and, still make them feel engaged into the experience? And there's a lot of play to be done if you just zoom out and realize the experience isn't just the exact moment when it happens. That moment wouldn't have happened if you hadn't, done the things before.
I love that. And I think it's equally true for the employee journey, right? Where actually, when you think about the moment of frustration that someone might be experiencing with their team, like, oh, my team members are not proactive enough or whatever, if you zoom out and look at the whole employee journey and what has happened when you hired them and when you onboarded them, right? And the first 3 months, etc., etc. I think a lot of answers to what is happening today might be lying in those initial parts of the journey. And so I think it's a really interesting also, and I see a lot of potential there when it comes to activating and embedding values, to really map out what your employee journey is and what are the moments that matter, which typically are the highs or the lows. Like the first day on the job, it's definitely a memorable moment. And so every experience that you have during that first day is going to leave an imprint on you, and you will remember it. When your first child is born, it might not be a work experience, but it's such a high in your life. So how you embrace that and what you do as an employer during that moment is going to matter. When someone gets a promotion, when someone fails miserably, right? When they're working on a project and it doesn't work out and they experience the first major failure, like how do you engage with them during that moment? I think there is so much opportunity there to design and engineer those experiences that are going to embody the culture and the values that you want to inculcate in your culture. So a really great exercise.
It is. And I think there are a few things to keep in mind with the employee journey as a whole. One is it's not linear. It's not like a transaction that we do with some other experiences in our life. We go, we buy, we come home. We loop around in this experience. Onboarding or joining isn't necessarily just something we do on our first day. We might change teams, we might change jobs, we might stay for a long time in the same company, and there are plenty of opportunities to think about different target groups in your organization who are touched by this part of the journey and process again. And as you're saying, also to somehow also reflect on how work and life are a flow that fit together. They're not apart. They're interacting with each other all the time. But also just to emphasize, because I've worked with this a long time and there's always this sense of overwhelm, like, but all of it can't be fantastic. No, not all of it should be fantastic. Most of it should work. On a very good level, it should work. If you use your data right, if you're actually asking questions, if you're actually looking at what is important, because I think that's a pivot point. And it's happened to me a lot of times in workshops. You spend so much time talking about certain things and you spend 5 minutes talking about little things. In the end, you go, what's the most important to you? What has the biggest impact? They will put all their votes in that little thing that you discussed for 5 minutes that didn't take up any space in the discussion, but it takes up a lot of space on the inside. So it really is about understanding where the importance and the opportunities for impact lies. And that's where you invest in your moments. And that's where you kind of put your really big engineering into. It's not every single thing. It's a lot of things need to work. Like your time reporting, if it's something you do once a month, maybe doesn't need to be fantastic. Maybe if you're a consultant and you need to do it in 6-minute increments, that should be a really good experience and it should be really easy because you're doing it all the time and it's really something that will, have a continuous impact on how you're experiencing your workday. So it really is about using the available data to understand where does it matter? And that's where you put your efforts. So the journey, I think, is a fabulous tool to get more holistic, to also weave in other pieces, to set ambitions, to get some basic data in place.
And be humble, as you say, right? And assume that you don't know the answers. Like something that you consider an important part of the employee journey might not be so important to your employees. I think this is one of the big learnings for me, that I've had exactly the same experience many times as you had, like the surprise. Oh my gosh, really? So that's important. Okay, well, we had no idea. And it's a little bit like also with surveys, right? You ask so many questions of people, and many of those things don't really matter to them. If you add an additional scale and you say, how important is that for your success in your role? This is really a huge insight. It's a little bit like asking people, do you like this wallpaper? Someone said to me on an interview. And you can say, no, it's rubbish. It's like on a scale from 1 to 10, it's a 1. I hate it. And then you just jump and fix the wallpaper. But you don't ask, hey, how important is the wallpaper to your success in your role, or how you feel in this organization? And then they would probably say, not important at all. But you asked me if I like it, and so I told you I don't.
And I've seen that a lot of times when you actually do these initiatives where you reach out and you ask people the questions and you go into the depth of same thing as you were talking about, start, stop, continue, kind of where are we at? Where's the friction? Where's the sense of success? Then you also actually get information that can shape how you ask questions. Because I've seen this the same as you lots of times. We're not even asking about the things that matter. And then we don't have a way to also manage that experience and ensure that we're not just activating it in one moment, but we're embedding it continuously. So it is also, I think, about daring to break it down. And that's where I think, the behavior level becomes really impactful, the getting data that is useful so that you can ask the right questions to the right people in the right moments of the journey and know that, okay, this is working or it isn't working. And if it isn't, you have a chance to go back and ask for information and improve it. It's not a fixed thing. And I think that's also maybe has been a big learning, and a big thing for me is just to regard it as a living organism. We're in this shift now where we're like going from doing change to being in change. And I think it's the same with culture. Is we need to understand that even if we come up with a solution today, that's fantastic. It might not be fantastic in 6 months, or it will last you 5 years. Nobody knows. So it has to be a living dialogue, something that you follow up on, something that you have a continuous discussion or measurements of. And you can, if you break it down to the practical things, you can actually keep track of it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I see it even, at a personal level, just going back to my journaling practice and jotting down behaviors or ways of showing up so that I'm in alignment with these values. It evolves too, even for one person, right? Because as you change as a person, or as you become more aware of certain aspects of your life or certain challenges in your life, you suddenly realize, oh, and this is important too. And so you add it to your list, and maybe something else is no longer important. So I think values to me, perhaps the value in itself doesn't change, but how you define it and how you translate it into those actionable things, it should evolve, because you evolve as an organization. There's no company that I know of that is static and that doesn't change. And so I think it would only make sense that the way we express our values is going to change as well. Okay, I want us to shift gears because we are running out of time.
Yes.
Let's do a quick rapid fire to leave our listeners with a few practical ideas. This is completely improvised, by the way, listeners. We haven't prepared for this. This is all completely improvised as a conversation, and the rapid fire is improvised as well. So let's see what we can come up with for you.
Okay.
I think a useful question to ask at the end of this is, what are your top 3 tips for our listeners, actionable things that they can do to go about activating their core values in the organization?
Great question. First thing, always the first thing, talk to people in the organization. Don't skim. Don't talk to HR business partners. Don't go through leaders. Talk to the people you want to understand directly, for sure. I think that's the very core. Otherwise, you're just creating filters between you and the other person.
I like that. Okay, so yeah, speak with your people. I agree with that one. And to build on it and to add to it. So if you speak to your people, I think one of the questions that is worth asking them is what I call MII, which is not missing in action, but it's like, what meaning does this value have for you? And this is the M of the MII. And then what impact does this value have on the work that you are doing? The A in my MIA, not I acronym, is application. So like, how can I live this value in this role? Because it's going to be different from person to person. And I think, again, going back to the granularity and helping people see the relevance of those things to their work, these can be quite useful questions. So that's my 5 cents. So go with number 2, Tiff.
Yeah, I think it's along the similar lines is, get pretty granular with people. So talk to them, but in a very structured way. Ask them about their blockers, their enablers to living out a certain value, to understand how it plays out in their reality and how you might really be supportive of it. Get as nitty-gritty as you can. Don't stop at I think there's a confusion between this and that. No. Why? You can use your 3 whys or your 5 whys. I mean, there are a lot of those tips. Just
there are 10 whys.
However many levels you need to go down, but get into the practical application, so you're not ending up with just a gym card in your pocket, basically.
Yeah, totally. And we're talking human to human here, by the way, right? So it's not like pulse surveys or surveys. It's really talking humans talking to humans. I think that's an important part of this. So me building on your number 2 would be to say, make the obstacle the way. So like, if you know that your outdated customer service administration system stands in the way, act on that, because you want to be basically that to become the path to better customer service. I think this is one of the most powerful learnings that I've had on the journey, that we shouldn't give up in face of these obstacles. We should make these obstacles enablers into creating an environment where people can display or manifest the values in a way that is feasible, or easier, or simply even more pleasurable, because it all maximizes the chances of seeing more of those behaviors in your company. Okay, so let's go for number 3. What do you have for us?
Number 3, what came up for me is a very simple exercise, actually, which is impact versus effort. Find a way to prioritize based on that insight. You will get a lot. There's a lot of insight that comes out of discussions like that. And let's face it, you can't do it all at once. You probably shouldn't. So find a way of prioritizing. Impact versus effort is an easy way. Then you can also kind of gauge if you have resources to do things or not. Always try to go for as much impact as possible. That's where you want. And then you can kind of regulate based on what type of effort is available to you. But I would say don't forget about the impact piece, because it's easy to then kind of fall for your own bias and go, oh, this sounds important. No, we're not asking you what's important. We're asking them what's important, and you get to prioritize with it and choose wisely. So I would see how you can just focus your efforts just to make it realistic, because otherwise it also feels like a very big elephant to take on.
I so agree. Speaking of impact, and perhaps a slightly different impact, building on your point, here is my number 3. I would really suggest to play with transmitting your values through storytelling, and especially sharing stories about the impact that you make as an organization. So it's these transformation stories of, how are we making this world a better place? They can be very, very powerful. War stories, how we've overcome difficulties. And typically, organizational values are so incredibly visible in these stories. Your origin story as well. But I think impact, particularly because more and more people, and especially now with Gen Z coming into the workforce and being a huge part of the workforce already, it's so important for people to know that they're doing something meaningful. My research also shows that there are 3 things that people need in the workplace. One is to have fun, and I mean the joy of work itself, not just fun, but the joy of work, to have a sense of meaning and to have a sense of belonging. I think storytelling is a wonderful, wonderful, simple way of hitting all three, because it's an enjoyable experience where people can connect with others, you create a sense of belonging, and you really help people to make meaning and understand who we are and what we stand for at a visceral level almost. It's quite emotional, it's very impactful. So that would be my final tip in terms of how to activate your values. Stories are so incredibly effective and rich in cultural meaning, and we don't use them enough, I feel, in companies.
I would just to add a nuance to that is making sure that those stories are from diverse places in your organization, because it's a very, very safe way to not leverage the full potential of storytelling when you're only telling the stories from one angle and making it about a very specific type of leader or a very specific type of competence. So also find a way of thinking in a diverse way about how you storytell, as I find there's a lot of inspiration to get from all different places in an organization, for sure.
Yeah, I so agree with that. And I know a few companies that do it really well. We have a member in the CultureBrained community that told us how they use stories during their annual meeting. And he said, exactly what you said. So they had incredibly diverse stories. There were stories of huge triumphs and successes, but there was also a story of someone who always felt an outsider, was never able to hold on to a job and finally found their home in their company, and what that felt for them, and how they basically moved from a self-identity of I'm a failure, I'm not good enough, to finding a place where they knew they could be successful. And he said that story, which was a story of the least impressive, let's say, business result or whatever, because it wasn't really about that, was a story that had everyone cry, and was a story that had everyone say this was the most impactful meeting that we've ever had as a company. And yes, when you hear something like that about your company, like someone who never felt they belonged suddenly found a place where they not only are embraced, but can completely redefine themselves and say, I am capable and I can be successful. And this is my tribe. It's amazing. And with that, I think we can say thank you for being here with us. We decided to turn it into a monthly conversation where Shani and I meet together and chat about all things culture. So this one was about how we can embed values and how we can activate them, but you can expect many other topics that you grapple with as you are trying to cultivate a thriving culture, a place where people can do their best work. So thank you for being here with us. Thank you, Shani. And I'm looking forward to our future conversations.
Me too.
I'm Aga Bajer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast. And this is the Culture Lab team.
Anis El Nabarawi, production manager.
Sound producer, Heather McPherson, Twisted Spur Media.
I hope that you enjoyed this new monthly format where Shani and I discuss all things culture. And if you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share this episode with someone who might appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared. If you want to dive even deeper into the topics we discuss on the Culture Lab podcast, and if you'd like to participate in one-of-a-kind Culture Accelerator program, plus a global community of peers, you might want to check out the CultureBrained community. CultureBrained is for people who look for new ways of cultivating remarkable cultures in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. If you are in charge of a culture-shaping project, and if you believe that work should be synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, I think you will feel at home in the CultureBrained community. You You can learn more at tinyurl.com/CultureBrained. And there's a link in the show notes. And now, a quick preview of the upcoming episode. This time, my guest is Kieran Snyder, a highly accomplished business leader and technology executive. Kieran is also a world-renowned expert on language and bias at work, and her writing has appeared in Fortune, the New York Times, Slate, and the Washington Post. She published the initial Fortune data studies, which put the topic of language bias in performance feedback on the map. As the co-founder and CEO of Textio, Kieran led her team in the invention of augmented writing, which basically uses machine learning algorithms to help writers like you and me communicate more effectively. Textio's augmented writing software is used by hundreds of Fortune 1000 companies globally to recruit more inclusively and communicate more equitably at work. So here is a short snippet from our conversation.
The thing I often tell people leaders is that if you really care about making sure that people in the organization are receiving effective feedback equitably, you can't promote any manager who's not providing it. You can't give a people manager a good review if they're not engaged in systematic, high quality feedback conversations with all of their employees. Do you care enough to put compensation on the line, right? Do you care enough to make it a real, day job level accountability so that when people have to make choices about what they're spending their time on, they're choosing to spend time on that. And if it's not that important to you, no software in the world is really going to help you change your system.
Thanks again for tuning in. If you want to get free resources on cultivating a remarkable, powerful, and authentic company culture, especially in a business that scales, type this into your browser: agabayer.com/resources. If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab yet, please do it now. That's the best way you can support our work. And finally, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on the platform that you listen to. Thank you, and you are amazing for listening to this point. Not many people do.